I'm going out with Mark Stevens this Saturday night, Sarah said, her voice flat, as if discussing laundry. She stood by the kitchen island, scrolling her phone, not looking at me. My hand paused midair, a beer bottle suspended. The air went still, a sudden vacuum in the room. And I still expect you to be home when I get back, Paul. My parents, bless their practical hearts, built a life on predictability. Their marriage was a structure of consistent habits, a brick-and-mortar reality that rarely shifted. My father worked at the plant, my mother kept the house, and their conversations revolved around groceries, the weather, and the occasional civic election. There was no grand passion, no soaring romance, just a steady, mutual effort to keep the lights on and the lawn mowed. It was the only model I knew for a long time, a reliable blueprint for a stable life. I watched them, absorbed their rhythm, and assumed it was the way things were meant to be. Then I met Sarah in a freshman English class at State. She was different from anyone I'd known in our small Indiana town. Sharp, direct, with a quick wit that intimidated most of the boys and fascinated me. Her ambition was palpable, a buzzing energy that made my own laid-back approach to college feel almost lazy. She wanted to be a lawyer, she told me on our third date, not just any lawyer, but one who argued in court, who made decisions, who commanded respect. I was drawn to that drive, the clarity of her purpose. It felt like something solid, something real, something worth investing in. And I did invest. I worked 2 jobs through college, supplementing my scholarship so Sarah could focus on her studies. While she was buried in torts and contracts, I was stacking shelves at the grocery store or pouring concrete on construction sites. It felt right, a joint venture. We were building something together, a future where her success would be our success. We talked about a modest house, maybe 2 kids, a life earned through hard work. It was a familiar narrative, one I understood, one I believed in. She graduated at the top of her class, passed the bar on the first try, and quickly landed a position at a prominent downtown firm. Her career took off like a rocket. The first few years, I was proud, telling anyone who would listen about her latest courtroom victory. Then the paychecks started arriving. Her income, initially a pleasant supplement to my own, soon eclipsed it. Then it dwarfed it. The shift was subtle at first, a quiet reordering of priorities, a new gravity in her step. My modest salary as a high school history teacher became less a contribution and more an accessory. The power dynamic changed without a single spoken word, a quiet, undeniable fact. We had always talked about children, vaguely, in the way young couples do. Later, we'd say, when we're more settled, when the student loans are gone. But later kept getting pushed back. Sarah's career demanded more hours, more travel. Then one Tuesday evening, over takeout pizza, she laid it out plain. "I don't think I want children, Paul," she said, her voice even without apology. "My work is my life. I don't have space for anything else." I just nodded. The decision, once postponed, was now definitive. I swallowed the resentment, tried to rationalize it. My life, my understanding of our future, had just irrevocably changed, and I had offered no argument. Sarah's dominance in our marriage solidified. She made the big decisions, the small ones, the ones in between. My opinions were listened to, sometimes considered, but rarely acted upon. I became passive, a quiet observer in my own life, allowing her currents to carry me. Yet there was an odd counterpoint. As she pulled away from the idea of family, she seemed to lean more into physical intimacy. It was frequent, sometimes intense, a temporary illusion of connection that filled some void for her, and for me, a desperate, hollow grasp at what we once had. It was a fragile, superficial bond. Then came the Mark Stevens announcement. It was Friday evening. We were eating leftovers. "I'm going out with Mark Stevens this Saturday night," she said. My hand froze. Mark Stevens was a junior partner at her firm, a man known for his expensive suits and even more expensive sports car. She saw my reaction, a flicker of something, but she didn't pause. "He asked me to dinner. I said yes." She returned to her phone, scrolling, as if the world outside her screen had ceased to exist. "You're going on a date?" My voice was flat, unfamiliar. "It's not a date, Paul. It's just dinner. I need new experiences, my life has gotten a little predictable." She looked up, her expression a mix of challenge and indifference. And I still expect you to be home when I get back, of course. I'd like for things to be normal between us. Otherwise, a cold emptiness spread through me like frost on a window pane. I understood then that argument was futile. There was no logic to appeal to, no shared foundation left to stand on. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of intent, a new reality being imposed. I finished my meal in silence, the food tasting like ash. Later, when we went to bed, I turned away from her, offering no goodnight kiss, no gesture of affection. The rupture was clear, a chasm that had opened between us. The next day, Saturday morning, I went to work at the high school, grading papers in my quiet classroom. But my mind was miles away, watching Sarah's casual betrayal replay. She was already dead to me, I realized, even as she breathed, walked, and laughed in our shared house. The weekend stretched before me, a vast, empty space filled with the dread of her date, the looming threat of divorce, the unraveling of everything I had built. My thoughts, usually orderly, turned dark. If everything was broken, if there was no way back, no way forward, then someone had to die. I drove home from the high school that Saturday afternoon, the engine humming its familiar, steady rhythm. The sky was clear, typical early spring. Sarah's car was in the driveway, which meant she hadn't left yet. The front door was unlocked as usual. I stepped inside, the house quiet except for the sound of running water from the upstairs bathroom. Sarah was in the shower, preparing for her evening. Her overnight bag sat by the front door, a black leather duffel, packed and ready. I walked into the living room, setting my briefcase down near the armchair. From its hidden compartment, I extracted the handshake. It was a 9mm, a Beretta I had purchased years ago, kept for home protection and occasional target practice. It felt heavy and cold in my palm. I checked the magazine, 7 rounds. I chambered around, the metallic click surprisingly loud in the silent house. Then I placed the weapon beneath the cushion of the couch where my hand could reach it quickly and discreetly. My intention was clear, focused on Mark's inevitable arrival. Minutes passed, the shower stopped. I heard her moving around upstairs, the faint sounds of dressing. I sat on the couch, my posture relaxed, outwardly calm. The front door opened and closed. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, then saw her emerge from the bedroom. She was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, a deep emerald green that shimmered under the living room lights. Her hair was still damp, styled neatly. She looked ready. She grabbed her bag from beside the door. Then, the honk, a sharp, impatient blare from a car horn outside. Mark was here. He hadn't bothered to come to the door, a small detail, but one that confirmed his disrespect. Sarah didn't even flinch. She just picked up her bag. As she passed me on her way out, she paused. She reached out, her fingers lightly tapping the top of my head, a casual, almost absent-minded gesture. "Don't wait up, Paul," she said, her voice light, dismissive. Then she walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. I heard the car drive away, the hum of Mark's expensive engine fading into the distance. I sat there still, my hand hovering near the cushion. My initial plan, the one that involved confronting Mark, had been thwarted. The growl I stifled was not one of rage, but of a calculated strategy disrupted. My mind quickly readjusted. The house was completely silent now. I was alone. I moved to the bookshelf, pulling out a photo album, the kind with sticky plastic sheets. Old photographs, yellowing slightly at the edges. Sarah and me, younger, smiling, at Niagara Falls, on a hiking trip in the Smokies, at some college picnic. Evidence of a shared history, a life we built, now just fragments of paper and fading color. I studied them, detached, a logical observer of a past that no longer existed. I had no one to call. My parents were gone, their stable, predictable world a distant memory. My sister lived clear across the country, caught up in her own life. Sarah had been my closest connection, my everything. But her interest in me, my life, had evaporated long ago. The isolation was absolute, a cold, hard fact. I walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing in the dim light. I logged into our joint bank account. I moved the bulk of our savings, every dollar I could legally access, into a separate account under my name. It was a logical step, a defensive maneuver. I then drafted an email, carefully, precisely. I detailed Sarah's affair with Mark Stevens, citing specific dates and observations, her open disregard for our marriage, her professional indiscretion. I sent it to the managing partner of her law firm, CCing Human Resources. I attached no emotional pleas, just facts. It was a professional document designed to cause maximum damage. Next, I found a clean sheet of paper. I wrote a brief note, concise and to the point. I specified no reasons, no accusations, just a simple farewell. I folded it once and placed it on the coffee table. Then from my finger, I removed my wedding ring. It had felt tight 4 years. I placed it on top of the note. My hand was steady. I returned to the couch, sinking back into the cushions. I didn't reach for the weapon immediately. Instead, I closed my eyes. Images flickered through my mind. Sarah laughing on our first date, her bright eyes fixed on me. The day we bought our small house, full of shared dreams. The quiet evenings spent reading together. Bodies close, a comfortable silence between us. These were the memories I chose to hold on to, not the recent ones, not the betrayal. After a long moment, I opened my eyes. The room was growing darker, shadows creeping into the corners. My resolve was solid, hard as granite. I reached under the cushion. My fingers closed around the cold, familiar grip of the Beretta. I raised it slowly, the muzzle pointing toward the ceiling, then steadily turning it towards my own head. "I'm sorry, Mom, Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I really tried." Then I pulled the trigger. It was Sunday morning. The weekend for Sarah had run its course. She lay in Mark Stevens' bed, the expensive sheets a pale contrast to the cool light filtering through the blinds. His apartment was located in a newer development downtown, a place of glass and polished concrete, far removed from the quiet predictability of our suburban home. Paul, the man she married, the life they built, the future she had so decisively discarded, was absent from her mind. He was, by her own later admission, a non-factor. Mark shifted beside her, reaching for his phone on the nightstand. "So," he began, his voice raspy with sleep, "how do you suppose Paul's taking all this?" Sarah didn't even turn her head. "Paul, what's there to take? He knew what he signed up for." Her tone was dismissive, almost bored. The question itself seemed to annoy her, an unnecessary intrusion into her carefully constructed reality. "I mean the whole weekend," Mark pressed, a faint note of concern in his voice. "Has he tried to reach you?" She finally turned, propping herself on an elbow, her gaze sharp. "No, he hasn't. Why would he? I told him I needed space. I told him I needed new experiences. He knows how I operate." It was not a lie. She had indeed informed me. Her expectation was simple. I was to comply. "Honestly, Mark, I haven't thought about him once since I walked out the door yesterday. Not a single time." She spoke this as a statement of fact, a testament to her focus, not a confession of neglect. Mark chuckled, a low sound. "Well, he's a little older, isn't he? They tend to be more set in their ways, less prone to dramatic outbursts, I suppose. Easier to manage." He paused, thoughtful. "We talked about this, before you came over. You were quite clear about your intentions." "My intentions remain clear," Sarah affirmed, her voice crisp. "I want you, Mark. I want a future where I don't feel held back. And I still want Paul to be home when I get there." She paused, a glint in her eye. "In fact, I plan on making sure he knows exactly what he's missing. Right there, in our bed. I want him to see it, to remind him." She believed this to be an act of power, a way to further subjugate, not a calculated cruelty that would ultimately backfire. "He won't do anything. Paul's a coward. Always has been. He never stands up for himself." Mark seemed to consider this, tracing an abstract pattern on the sheets. "You know the Connors case at the firm last year? Remember that one? The husband, Gerald, seemed perfectly placid. His wife, Brenda, thought he wouldn't do anything either. Said he was too meek. Then one night he just snapped. Messy business." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Did he make any kind of protest, Sarah? Any verbal outburst? Any physical indication of distress when you told him you were coming here?" "He just sat there on the couch," she recounted, recalling the scene from Friday night with the shrug. He'd been quiet since Thursday night, ever since I mentioned your name. Just staring at the television, not really watching. I told him what I was doing, and he didn't say a word, just sat there like a bump on a log. Pathetic, really. She sounded bored, dismissing my silence as weakness. Mark's brow furrowed. He hasn't called or sent any texts? Nothing since you told him about tonight? No, she confirmed. Not a peep, which is exactly what I expected. When I make a decision, Paul knows it's final. He knows better than to argue. Her confidence was absolute, rooted in years of unchallenged authority within our marriage. She genuinely believed her resolute nature was the cause of my silence, not a profound, unaddressed pain. Mark leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. A sharpness entered his voice. Or maybe, he suggested, his tone flat, he's already ended your marriage. Not with a fight, but with a simple, quiet withdrawal. Before you even got the chance to initiate anything yourself. Sarah scoffed, a short, dismissive sound. Please, Paul loves me. He can't live without me. This with you, Mark, she gestured vaguely around the room. This is just sex. He knows that. We all know that. She presented it as an immutable truth, a fact of nature, impervious to any other interpretation. Mark Stevens had listened to Sarah's confident assertions regarding my perceived cowardice, regarding my enduring love for her, and the triviality of their affair. His initial skepticism, that flicker of doubt he held about my quiet disposition, seemed to soften. Perhaps it was her unwavering conviction, or the simple desire to avoid further conflict. He settled then into a more accommodating posture, a silent acceptance of her narrative. But Sarah was not done. She withheld any further intimacy, leaning away from him in the quiet aftermath of their conversation. Her demand was precise. I want you to be there, Mark, she stated, her voice firm. When I go back, I want him to see us. I want him to know what he's lost. He needs to be punished for making me feel like this. The punishment she sought was not justice, but a public humiliation, a reaffirmation of her power. Mark, perhaps seeing no other path forward, reluctantly agreed. His participation was a concession, a small price for the continuation of their liaison. It was late Sunday night when Mark's car, that expensive sedan he drove, pulled into the familiar driveway of our house. The streetlights cast long, cold shadows across the lawn. The house itself was dark, quiet, a solid block against the fading light of the day. A detail Sarah surely noted, though perhaps not consciously at first, was the state of the yard. The grass, usually meticulously mowed every Saturday morning, stood a good 3 inches too high, a shaggy, unkempt green. It was a deviation from my usual routine, a small but undeniable sign of disorder. As they approached the front door, Sarah likely made a mental note of the yard's condition. Another item for the list of my perceived failures, another reason for a sharp word, a reprimand delivered with the same cool detachment she used for legal briefings. In her mind, the simple presence of Mark, her new romantic interest, would not disrupt the established order of her domestic life. I was still Paul, still the steady, predictable husband, just one who needed to be reminded of his place. Mark, however, seemed to retain a sliver of apprehension. Are you ready for this, Sarah? He asked, his voice low, a last-minute check. For the confrontation? Her response was immediate, confident. Of course. It was delivered without a hint of doubt, a testament to her unshakable belief in her own authority. What do you expect to happen? Mark prompted, pushing her to vocalize her strategy. He likely wanted to understand the contours of the impending scene, to brace himself or to ensure she had thought this through. Sarah did not elaborate. She simply retrieved her overnight bag from the back seat, slinging it over her shoulder. She walked toward the front door, her posture erect, purposeful. Mark followed, his footsteps a beat behind hers on the concrete path. She reached the door. Her hand went to the knob. She would have noticed that the deadbolt was not engaged. The lock was unchanged, a small victory in her mind, further proof of my perceived inaction, my passive acceptance. I hadn't even bothered to secure the house. Not even that. It confirmed her assumptions. She turned the knob. The door swung inward with a soft, almost imperceptible click. The moment it opened, it hit her. A smell. It wasn't faint. It was putrid, thick and overwhelming, a scent that spoke of decay, of something profoundly wrong, something that had been left to fester. It rolled out of the dimly lit interior of the house, heavy and nauseating. Sarah gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound. Her hand flew to her mouth, covering it, trying to ward off the foul air. She peered into the darkness within, her eyes straining to make sense of the gloom. The interior was still, silent, but the stench was a vibrant, undeniable presence. What she saw, or perhaps what she intuited, in that moment, in that first glimpse, was enough. A deep, primal revulsion seized her. She recoiled instantly, a sharp physical flinch, as if struck. Without thinking, with a sudden violent motion, she slammed the door shut. The sound echoed, a final definitive punctuation to her weekend. The moment the front door slammed shut, Sarah stumbled backward, away from the putrid cloud that had billowed out. She took 2 desperate steps, then doubled over in the neatly manicured, despite the unmowed grass, front yard, her body convulsing. The expensive dinner she had shared with Mark less than an hour ago rose, unbidden and violent, into the cool night air. The retching was loud, ragged, a visceral response to the horror she had just encountered. Mark, who had been standing a step or two behind her, approached cautiously. He kept his distance, his face pale in the dim light. "Hey, Sarah, what's going on? Are you okay?" His voice was thin, betraying a fear that transcended mere concern. He saw the vomit, the shaking, the pure, unadulterated terror on her face. Sarah straightened up slowly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes wide and unfocused. Her words came out in broken fragments, a desperate stammer. He's in there. Paul, he's dead." The final word was a whisper, as if merely speaking it made it more real, more terrifying. Mark's composure shattered. "Dead?" he practically shouted, his voice cracking. "Are you sure? What do you mean, dead?" He still hadn't moved closer to the door, his gaze fixed on Sarah, demanding an explanation, a confirmation that this was somehow not what it seemed. "Yes, dead," Sarah insisted, her voice gaining a panicked urgency. "On the couch. The whole couch is ruined. Everything in there is ruined." Her mind was scrambling, trying to process the visual, the smell, the unimaginable reality. "Oh God, Mark, what do we do? What do we do?" Her professional demeanor, her carefully constructed facade of control, was dissolving rapidly. Mark, visibly unnerved, ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "We need to call someone," he stammered. "Emergency services. The police." It was an obvious suggestion, but one he delivered with a hesitant, almost fearful tone, as if stating the painfully evident was a profound act of wisdom. Sarah snapped, the fear turning into sharp, desperate anger. "Oh, brilliant, Mark! Captain Hindsight over here. You think I hadn't figured that out?" Her words were laced with sarcasm, a desperate lashing out at the nearest available target. Mark flinched, his shoulders tightening. But then, as if by sheer force of will, he seemed to pull himself back, his face hardening, a flash of his usual calculated self-preservation. "Just call them, Sarah," he said, his voice flat, a warning. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. I didn't expect this. Not this." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, just stay here with me, until they come." Her voice was small, vulnerable, a stark contrast to the confident woman who had declared me a coward less than an hour ago. Mark hesitated, glancing around the dark, quiet street. He clearly wanted to leave, to put as much distance between himself and this unfolding nightmare as possible. "A few minutes," he conceded, his voice clipped. "Just until they get here. Then I'm gone." It was not a promise of support, but a temporary truce, a limited engagement. Sarah pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the emergency number. She spoke in hushed, urgent tones, relaying the address, the grim discovery. The operator, calm and professional, assured her that officers were already en route. "And ma'am," the operator added, "due to the nature of the situation and the potent odor, we advise you to remain outside the residence until emergency personnel arrive." "Understood," Sarah muttered, her voice barely audible. She ended the call. Mark gestured towards his car. "We should wait in the car. It's colder out here." She nodded numbly. They sat in the silent leather interior of Mark's luxury car, the engine off. The grim reality, like a heavy stone, settled deep within Sarah. Paul was truly gone. The man she had dismissed, humiliated, and discarded had, in his own final act, utterly destroyed her world. Life's costly choices. We make them one by one, sometimes without even realizing the true price until it's too late. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Sitting in Mark's car, the silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken dread. Sarah felt a tremor run through her. In the quiet of the night, a wave of something akin to regret washed over her. She hadn't truly wished Paul dead. Not truly. She had wanted him to hurt, to feel her power, to comply. But not this. This was too final, too messy. The tears began to flow, not for Paul, not really for the man himself, but for the future she had envisioned, one where he, the predictable, stable Paul, would always be there, a quiet, dependable presence, a caretaker in her old age, a constant against the relentless march of time. Mark, ever the pragmatist, watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer than before, "you need to call Arthur Jenkins, right now." Sarah looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Jenkins?" "Yes, Jenkins," Mark insisted. "This is going to be public. A suicide, a sudden death. The firm can't be caught off guard. He needs to know before the police start making calls, before the press gets wind of it. He hates surprises, especially this kind." He spoke with a detached, professional assessment, understanding the corporate ripple effect before the personal one. Sarah nodded slowly, the professional imperative cutting through her emotional haze. "You're right, Arthur, of course." She understood the optics, the necessity of managing the narrative from the firm's perspective. It was ingrained in her training, a reflex. "Do it now," Mark urged, a nervous edge to his voice. "Before the patrol cars pull up, before it's official." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to compartmentalize, to pull her emotions back into their carefully constructed boxes. Her face hardened, the tears still visible, but the expression firming into her lawyer's mask. She located Arthur Jenkins's home number in her contacts. The phone rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Jenkins?" He sounded exactly as he always did, even at this late hour. Crisp, alert, professional. "Arthur, it's Sarah," she managed, her voice still trembling slightly, but under control. "Sarah, good evening. To what do I owe the late call?" His tone was neutral, but with an underlying expectation of important news. "Arthur, I have some very difficult news," she began, choosing her words carefully. "It's Paul, my husband. He's dead. I just found him. It appears to be a suicide." She omitted the details of discovery, the stench, the ruined furniture. The implication of suicide was enough for now. It shaped the narrative. There was a brief pause on the other end, a silence that stretched for a beat too long. Then Jenkins's voice, unsettlingly calm, responded. "I see. Well, Sarah, that certainly explains a good deal, including the rather disturbing email Paul sent to me on Friday night." Sarah's brow furrowed. The raw, immediate shock of his statement cut through her grief and fear. "Email? Paul sent you an email? Why would he do that?" The idea was so preposterous, so outside her understanding of Paul's passive nature, that it momentarily eclipsed the gravity of her own situation. "Yes, Sarah, a rather detailed email," Jenkins continued, his voice still measured, clinical. "Late Friday night, after I'd returned from the country club. About you. About Mark." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing their full weight to settle. "I read it, of course, and I replied to him. I assured him we would look into the matter first thing Monday morning." Then a shift in his tone. The calm, professional demeanor dissolved, replaced by something sharper, colder. "So, Sarah," Arthur Jenkins said, his voice flat, direct, devoid of any lingering courtesy. "Are Paul's accusations true?" The question hung in the air, heavy and direct. Sarah felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The professional calm she had just managed to regain began to fray. Her voice, when it came, was thin, cautious. What accusations, Arthur? I don't understand. She was grasping for time, for a way to reorient herself, to understand the landscape of this new, unexpected attack. Jenkins, however, was relentless. He cut through her evasions with surgical precision. Did you, Sarah, spend the weekend, specifically last night, with Mark Stevens? His tone was not accusatory, but rather that of an interrogator seeking factual confirmation. Sarah swallowed hard. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. There was no point in lying about his whereabouts. Mark was sitting right beside Hector. And was that engagement, shall we say, physically involved? Jenkins pressed further, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He was referring to the morals clause in her contract, a stringent requirement of professional conduct and fidelity, particularly for senior associates and partners. It was a firm with old money, old values, and a reputation for uncompromising rectitude. Lying now would be far more damaging than the truth. Sarah paused, weighing the immediate gut-wrenching shame against the calculated, career-ending repercussions of a proven lie. The truth, however unpalatable, was the only viable path. Yes, she confirmed, the word barely audible. There was another pause. Jenkins let out a slow, deliberate breath. I see, he finally said, his voice laced with a profound disappointment that cut deeper than anger. Well, Sarah, my condolences on Paul's passing. Truly. He was, by all accounts, a decent man, but I must say I am profoundly disappointed in your judgment. He didn't belabor the point, didn't need to. The disappointment itself was a verdict. Have you notified law enforcement? He asked, shifting back to the practical. Yes, Sarah confirmed, her voice still shaky. I called them moments ago. They're on their way. Good, Jenkins said. Now listen carefully. You will be granted a week's leave effective immediately. Consider it a vacation. Use this time to handle Paul's affairs, make arrangements. We will discuss your future employment with the firm when you return. The words future employment hung in the air, a clear, unspoken threat. Sarah, despite the fog of shock and fear, felt a flicker of professional instinct. But Arthur, the Wilson case. I'm lead counsel. The deposition is scheduled for Tuesday. She was trying to assert her value, to remind him of her indispensability. Jenkins sighed, a sound of weary impatience. Brenda Miller, he stated, referring to her second assistant. You remember Brenda, don't you? Your second chair? The one who actually does most of the legwork? Sarah felt a wave of numbness. Yes, she managed, acknowledging Brenda's competence. It was a jab, a subtle reminder that she was not as irreplaceable as she liked to believe. Brenda will handle the Wilson case, Jenkins continued, his voice firm. She is perfectly capable. You will instruct her to file for a continuance immediately. There will be no argument on this point, Sarah. He left no room for appeal. Your priority, as of this moment, is Paul. You will make the arrangements. You will put his life in order. I expect nothing less. And again, Sarah, I am profoundly disappointed. He ended the call without another word, leaving her to grapple with the immediate fallout of both Paul's death and her shattered career. The line went silent. Sarah slowly lowered her phone, her fingers still gripping it tightly. She sat in Mark's car, staring out at our darkened house, the streetlights casting long, unmoving shadows. She understood Jenkins' disappointment. The full weight of his cold, businesslike assessment settled on her, a weight heavier than the initial shock of discovery. Her career, the very foundation of her identity and ambition, was now precarious. Jenkins, before he disconnected, had one more question, delivered with the same emotionless precision. Is Mark Stevens currently with you, Sarah? His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth or concern, just a demand for information. Yes, sir, she had replied, her voice small, a subordinate admitting to a superior. Inform him he is to report to my office at 7 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning, Jenkins had instructed, the directive absolute. Do not be late, and do not, under any circumstances, speak to anyone else at the firm about this before then. Understood, Arthur, Sarah had managed. I'll tell him. Then a brief, perfunctory sound of condolence, almost an afterthought. My sincerest condolences again, Sarah, on your loss. And then a click. The call ended. She was left with the dead silence of the phone and the chilling finality of Jenkins's tone. His demeanor had been unyielding, focused solely on the firm's reputation and the immediate damage control. There was no personal comfort, no allowance for her shock or distress. It was all business, cold and calculated. Mark, who had been watching her face intently, shifted in his seat. "So?" he asked, his voice hesitant, almost awkward. "What did he say? Are we okay?" He knew the answer or suspected it, but needed to hear it. Sarah turned to him, her face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. "He wants you in his office at 7 a.m., she stated, her voice flat. "He knows everything, Mark. Paul sent him an email, a detailed one, about us, about this weekend." The last words were almost a whisper. Mark's face, which had been tight with nervous anticipation, now relaxed into a look of profound resignation. He let out a long, slow sigh. "Crap," he muttered, the single word encompassing the full scope of their predicament. "Crap doesn't even begin to cover it," Sarah finished for him, a bitter edge to her voice. "We're totally screwed." She knew it, he knew it. The carefully constructed facade of their lives, their careers, was crumbling. A desperate flicker of hope, however dim, ignited within her. "Maybe," she ventured, "maybe it won't be so bad for you. You're a junior partner, and you're good. Maybe they'll be more lenient. You don't have the same length of tenure as I do." It was a flimsy silver lining, a desperate attempt to salvage some shred of control or predict a less catastrophic outcome. Mark looked at her, his gaze skeptical. "Do you honestly believe that, Sarah?" His tone was devoid of any real conviction, a challenge to her fragile optimism. She shook her head, a slow, tired motion. "No," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Not really, but I have to hope, don't I? We both do." The hope was thin, a fragile thread, but it was all she had left. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Mark said, his voice quiet, sincere. "I really am." He sounded genuinely remorseful, perhaps for his part in the affair, or perhaps more for the professional fallout now facing them both. Sarah looked at our house, at the dark silhouette against the streetlights. A single patrol car, its lights off, was slowly turning the corner, approaching the house. "No," she replied, her voice soft, devoid of blame. "I'm sorry, too. I should have. I don't know, I just didn't think. I had no idea he would react like this." The truth of it hung in the air. She had never truly known me at all. The first cruiser pulled to a stop behind Mark's sedan, its presence a stark, official interruption to the quiet street. Moments later, a second cruiser arrived, followed by a white, unmarked van, the coroner's vehicle. Two uniformed officers exited their cars, their movements efficient, practiced. One of them, a younger man, immediately walked toward Mark's car. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move your vehicle," he stated, his voice calm but firm. "We need access to the driveway." Mark, without a word, started the engine and reversed, pulling his car to the curb further down the street. The officer watched him, then returned to his partner. The second officer, older with a neatly trimmed mustache and observant eyes, approached him. He was carrying a small notebook. "Ma'am, can I get your name and some identification, please?" Ira fumbled in her purse, her hands still slightly trembling, and produced her driver's license. She handed it to him. He glanced at it, then at her, his expression neutral. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller." He handed it back. The coroner's team, two individuals in scrubs and gloves, were already preparing their equipment. The lead officer nodded to them, "PM. All right, let's proceed." He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and slowly pushed open the front door. The moment the door opened, the foul, sickly sweet odor that had overwhelmed Sarah earlier now hit the officers. The younger officer visibly flinched, his hand instinctively rising toward his nose. The older officer, however, maintained his composure, though a flicker of distaste crossed his face. The coroner's team, more accustomed to such smells, began their methodical work, entering the house with their kits. The older officer turned back to Sarah, his pen poised over his notebook. "Mrs. Miller, can you tell me what happened? Just start from when you last saw your husband, Mr. Paul Miller, alive." Sarah took a shaky breath, trying to compartmentalize, to recall the facts in a clear, concise manner, as she would in a courtroom. I left on Friday afternoon," she began, her voice still a little tight. "He was here on the couch, alive. We were talking. She omitted the specifics of that conversation, the announcement of her date, the dismissal. I came back just now, this evening, and that's when I found him and called 911. The officer made a note. And the deceased is indeed your husband, Paul Miller? Yes, she confirmed, the word feeling hollow, detached from the man she had just seen inside. He looked at her, his gaze steady, then briefly raised an eyebrow. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it conveyed a silent question. So you were gone the entire weekend, Mrs. Miller? Yes, she confirmed again, meeting his gaze. She knew what the question implied, what it suggested about her conduct. And where exactly were you during this entire weekend, Mrs. Miller? His tone remained neutral, professional, but the question was direct, probing. There was no room for evasion. Sarah's stomach churned, a familiar wave of nausea rising again. She glanced quickly toward Mark, who was now standing by his car, watching, his face unreadable in the dim light. I was with a coworker, she stated, the words feeling brittle on her tongue. It was technically true, but deliberately vague. The officer's pen paused. He looked from Sarah to Mark, then back to Sarah. And that coworker, would that be Mr. Mark Stevens, who just moved his car? Sarah swallowed. The legal training kicked in, the understanding that obfuscation would only make things worse. But the personal humiliation was acute. She felt her face flush, despite her best efforts to remain detached, professional. Yes, she confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. That's Mark. The officer nodded slowly, making another note. He continued to ask a series of additional questions. Had Paul seemed distressed recently? Were there any financial issues? Had he ever threatened self-harm? Sarah provided brief, factual answers, carefully editing her responses to omit any details that would further incriminate herself or Mark. The questions continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 20 minutes. Finally, he closed his notebook. All right, Mrs. Miller, that's all for now. We'll be in touch. He turned to speak with the lead coroner. Sarah stood there, the cool night air prickling her skin. She tried to appear nonchalant, as if this was just a routine inconvenience, but the heat in her cheeks was undeniable, betraying the shame and the raw, unwelcome reality of her situation. The police cars eventually left, taking Paul with them. Mark Stevens, with a clipped farewell, followed shortly after, vanishing into the night as completely as Paul had vanished from Sarah's life. The house, when Sarah finally re-entered it after the cleanup, felt hollow, haunted not by Paul's ghost, but by the profound silence of his absence. The consequences were swift and unyielding. Arthur Jenkins, true to his word, ensured that Sarah's legal career, once so promising, was quietly dismantled. The firm, protective of its image, offered a severance package contingent on her immediate, discreet resignation. Mark, too, faced the wrath of Jenkins. His partnership track evaporated, leaving him to search for employment in a less prestigious, less scrutinized environment. Sarah's carefully constructed world, built on ambition and ruthless calculation, had shattered under the weight of Paul's final desperate act. He had not fought her directly, but had instead chosen a method of retaliation that ensured her public humiliation and professional ruin, a meticulously executed plan of ultimate vengeance. She was left with a gutted house, a ruined reputation, and the chilling realization that her casual disregard had cost her everything. The true price of her betrayal was far greater than she had ever imagined, paid in full and with chilling finality. The police cruisers eventually left, taking Paul with them. Mark Stevens, with a clipped farewell, followed shortly after, vanishing into the night as completely as Paul had vanished from Sarah's life. The house, when Sarah finally re-entered it after the cleanup, felt hollow, haunted not by Paul's ghost, but by the profound silence of his absence. The consequences were swift and unyielding. Arthur Jenkins, true to his word, ensured that Sarah's legal career, once so promising, was quietly dismantled. The firm, protective of its image, offered a severance package contingent on her immediate, discreet resignation. Mark, too, faced the wrath of Jenkins. His partnership track evaporated, leaving him to search for employment in a less prestigious, less scrutinized environment. Sarah's carefully constructed world, built on ambition and ruthless calculation, had shattered under the weight of Paul's final desperate act. He had not fought her directly, but had instead chosen a method of retaliation that ensured her public humiliation and professional ruin, a meticulously executed plan of ultimate vengeance. She was left with a gutted house, a ruined reputation, and the chilling realization that her casual disregard had cost her everything. The true price of her betrayal was far greater than she had ever imagined, paid in full and with chilling finality.